the school community or outside. This is the Global Practice Sessions. It is connected with the Professional Practice course at the Waterloo School of Architecture, and it is a series of speakers talking about their engagement with the built environment, many of whom have a training in design, and talking about their path in their career and their motivations with the options of what can be done with the engagement with design and built environment, and their capacities to contribute to their communities, would be that large or small, whatever, and to the larger world beyond. So I'm going to formally introduce Abigail Moriah, and first of all say thank you, Abigail, for being with us. It's really great that you can be here this morning, and it's also great, as we found out, in comparison to our African colleagues, that having speakers from Toronto really is much easier. It's the difficulties of the connections, but ultimately we will be able to get recordings from all of our speakers, and so that content will be available. So Abigail Moriah is a registered professional planner who has worked as a senior development manager at the nonprofit real estate development corporation New Commons, and prior to that was an associate development planner for the Toronto Community Housing Corporation in Regent Park, and also she worked in Halifax's youth shelter housing system. She was co-founder of the Black Planning Project and the mentoring initiative for Indigenous and planners of color initiatives to reshape planning and to connect to BIPOC planners. She holds an MSc in planning from the University of Toronto. She has worked and volunteered in the public and nonprofit community-based sector for 15 years. Her diverse background has included program development, program management, and research and policy. She actively volunteers with organizations in areas of strategic planning, organizational capacity, and youth development in Canada and the Caribbean. So once again, thank you, Abigail, for being with us today. We're looking forward to your talk. And I will turn it over to you, and I will leave the recording going since it's a continuity. So if you could share your screen as you do. And,
okay, thanks for your introduction. Making sure I have this. So can you all see that okay?
Yes, that's, and you're on presenter mode, so that's perfect. Thanks.
Okay, great, good. So it's getting used to, I'm sure everybody is, in terms of presenting to your screen and seeing yourself or your presentation anyway. So good to meet everybody, even though I can't see you as I present. So I thought what I would do today was actually to kind of move into talking a bit about my own journey and sort of the practice that I've engaged in and sort of why I've moved around in different ways. And so I'll do that first. So I'll talk a bit about my vision, as I said, my practice, some of the challenges that I've seen, and why I've made certain decisions. So this is, I've said, this is sort of my vision in many ways. I'm saying it more and more. I really focus on building equitable communities and looking at collaboration and innovative and inclusive practices for community transformation. So where do I actually state planning so much or talk anything about design, but I do think that those are important elements when we think about building communities. And certainly in getting there, I didn't necessarily start with saying this is exactly how I want to do it, but there has been a journey to get there. So some of my early inspiration really was my work in Nova Scotia, so that's where I grew up. And one of the things that I was doing in my undergrad years and following that was to be really more involved in community development and engagement. And so this is a picture of Abigail Street in Halifax, and this is a relatively recent picture. I think this was taken in 2014, and I left there about 2003, and so it looked very different. But one of the things that I was engaged in at the time, and really more as a student, young person coming into the work field, was around community organizing in response to it was in response to something that was going to happen to the community that the community was very concerned about, the placement of a facility near the community. And so there was a lot of work with those who were from the North End community, but also outside. So that's how I was engaged, like having been engaged, not living there, but really, really closely tied in many ways, and really to go and say, hey, what can we do, and feeling hopeful because there's a lot of folks involved, and in the end, not really feeling that the concerns that we had voiced were heard, and that led me to the question of asking, like, well, what is it that can be done? Like, what are other factors that really affect how community is built, and that affect the fabric of community and affect change in community? And that led me to kind of begin to explore urban planning and to pursue a master's in urban planning. At the same time, I had been working within or volunteering with an organization that was really focused on building leadership and strategic capacity at the community level, particularly in Black communities, to do what we were calling transformational change, working across sectors. And so that was really my, I guess I would say, building that muscle of community engagement and community development, and really recognizing the importance of that local work in order to inform larger transformational change, but also recognizing that it was really important to understand the broader systems and processes that were at play, and how to affect those, learn what they were, and to affect those at the same time. So moving to my practice, I after finishing my graduate studies, what I did was, outside of a year abroad, I actually came back and really wanted to get right into working in the context of housing and looking at affordable housing. And so I began my work with Toronto Community Housing primarily. I had done a few years in the nonprofit sector, so doing similar work at a paid scale that I was doing when I was in Halifax. So working with various neighborhood centers and organizations, and that really gave me a good sense as to like some of the local issues on the ground in Toronto, given that I hadn't I was only there as a student up until then, and so I didn't really have a good grounding and connection with the local community. And then I moved into Toronto Community Housing to do similar work around what we call tenant engagement or community engagement. There were some participatory processes around what was called participatory budgeting, where local communities were working with, they had a choice, an opportunity to engage in doing engagement, to engage in making decisions around what capital, if it was capital repairs, if it was introducing a playground or some of the physical and design elements, and could be repair as well to their buildings and their communities. And so really having an engaged process where tenants would be very involved in making those decisions. And then I shifted over to the majority, which was the majority of my time at TCHC, to work in the revitalization, the development and revitalization unit, where I had the opportunity to work on Regent Park revitalization for a few years, as well as two smaller revitalizations in the northeast of the city of Toronto, and a very short stint on Lawrence Heights as well. I decided to leave TCHC because I was really interested in thinking about and exploring and learning how to engage in other ways of developing affordable housing that would have used maybe different tools and mechanisms. So TCHC, the work there was really very focused as being a landlord with large pools of assets. There was an opportunity to develop in a particular way, and if we move into leaving that and moving to work with more smaller organizations, like some of the nonprofits that I had actually been engaged with in a different way prior to my time at TCC, they were working at a different scale. So they had a smaller site. They didn't have acres and acres of land. They didn't have properties. So there's a lot of different things that didn't. Is there an echo? Not sure. Are you hearing an echo as well?
Yeah, we're hearing an echo.
I can try to put my headphones on. It seems like it just started, but
yeah, it did. I was just wondering. I'm just going to check whether any of the participants have a mic turned on, which could be feeding back. I'm going to mute all, and then Abigail, mute everybody, and then I'll turn your mic on again. I hope that works, and if it doesn't, feel free to turn it on. But I'll try this just so we don't get that feedback. Mm-hmm. And then, okay, now I'm gonna try and unmute you. Okay. So Abigail, I think that I hope you can still hear me. Try unmuting because it doesn't give me a chance to unmute you. So maybe that was a bad idea.
Here I am. So I'm going to go back and reshare again.
Yeah, okay, that'd be great.
Seems like there's no echo anymore. I only heard it for about 30 seconds, but
yeah, I don't know. It could have been a mic got turned on accidentally or something. I'm going to mute myself again as soon as you get your screen back up. And I can edit this little bit out of the video so it doesn't cause disruption. Okay. Okay, so let's give it a try again. Do you want to try speaking again and see whether...
Okay, so can you see my presentation?
Yes, it's all up and yeah, we can see it as it was. So it's good.
Okay.
And I hear you fine. So if anybody in the call can't hear Abigail, please alert me, but either in the chat or with your hands up or something. But let's go carry on, and I think it's all good.
Okay. Sure. Okay, so so I was saying that one of the opportunities of switching to work at New Commons was really to do two things: to work at a different scale of doing affordable housing development, to use a different approach in terms of doing affordable housing development, because as I was saying, a lot of these organizations have they had less property that they were working with, they had less equity, so they had to bring different things to the equation to actually develop their lands. And then thirdly, to kind of look at a broader scale, Toronto Community Housing was clearly working and focusing on properties in Toronto. And it was primarily about replacing social housing, whereas working with New Commons Development, there was the opportunity to do affordable nonprofit housing development, which could include social housing, but it primarily focused on doing things such as I said, nonprofit housing development. It could be co-op housing development. So that was really the focus there. And then I decided to shift again, most recently, to do independent consulting, and that was for a couple of different reasons. One, again, looking at the areas that I could work, trying to have more of a focus outside of the Toronto and Ontario region, even though most of my work continues to be there right now, to also perhaps move from working mostly on housing to also think about other ways that I can support communities in terms of community asset development. And then secondly, the second part that I show there, nonprofit startups, is really around me recognizing that there are other areas that I was quite interested in doing work in, particularly around equity, and thinking of the role of the lens of equity and race in doing real estate and planning, and needing to do more work to wanting to be involved more strategically to support that work and to create spaces for that work to grow. And so that's what I'm doing right now. And I guess we can always come back to questions, but I wanted to kind of give you a bit of an overview in terms of the different areas that I have been engaged in. So I wanted to, focusing on social purpose real estate, because that's been essentially what most of my work has been, on the development side at least. This is just a little chart to kind of show you the different areas I've been engaged in. So certainly, given that I was at Toronto Community Housing for 10 years, most of my time, most of the work there, and most of the work you see listed here is connected to Toronto Community Housing. So here, and I'll actually go through, I have a few slides looking at community facilities. So the revitalization projects generally had, even though the focus was on social housing and replacing rent geared to income and replacing social housing, as well as adding market housing and other community amenities, because it was looking at a master planning process that wasn't just focused on the buildings and residential. It also had a community facility component. So one of the first projects I had a chance to work on lead was the Regent Park Athletic Grounds redevelopment. The other piece at Toronto Community Housing, I'll jump up here, was really around, as revitalization it really is focusing on demolishing what exists and then rebuilding and adding density. So these are the same projects I'd mentioned before: Lawrence Heights briefly, Regent Park for several years, And my last year I spent working in Allenbury Gardens and Leslie Imark, all in the city of Toronto. Then when I moved to New Commons Development, most of the work was still, even for a new build, that was still in infill, so it was a parking lot that is in its early stages I was engaged in, so this project is not constructed, even though I'll show you some rendering. And then in New Commons Development, we also had, one of the projects I also worked on was a tower renewal and retrofit, so basically the building is preserved 100%. But we're also trying to improve it so it can be more efficient. The areas that I haven't really done much work in is really looking at preservation and adding. So, you have a site, you're preserving the building, and you're also adding density to the site, even though that is one of the projects that I'm exploring right now. So this is just an example of the rendering of one of the projects that I worked on at New Commons Development. This was a tower renewal, retrofit, and renovation, and we worked closely with the area architects. And if you're aware of them, they do a lot of heritage and retrofit and renewal work, and they've really been leading the work in the city of Toronto around tower renewal and trying to upgrade, retrofit, and improve the quality, design, and efficiency of old tower buildings in the city of Toronto. And this work is done, as I said, with New Commons Development for a senior social housing provider in the city of Toronto. This is one of the more recent projects that I was just involved in for a couple of years, so for a few months before I left. So it was involved from the stage of the early feasibility to engaging an architect to prepare the early renderings that we could use for funding submissions. And this was a very quick process. I think we did that all in a period of 5 months between September and January. And so this is a rendering of the proposed development, and this is in Halifax, Nova Scotia, downtown Halifax. It's an apartment building. It's in the north end. So this was a really special project for me because it was one of the areas. It was the area in the community which really inspired me to kind of think about planning and sort of the physical transformation and the role of planning in community transformation. And as I said, this is a new build. And T.A. Scott was a local architect, and this was a project with New Commons Development and a co-op housing organization in Nova Scotia called Compass Co-op. And this was a community facilities project, Regent Park Athletic Grounds. And this was part of my work at TCHC. So it was one of the first development type projects that I was able to lead. And this was a neat process because we really worked a lot with the community to engage them in the process. So we had a youth advisory, and that youth advisory team was engaged in both working, so we would meet each time with the architect. It was either a collaborative, we'd meet with them to review any plans, and the youth were involved in planning as well as helping to lead and facilitate each of the town hall meetings. We had 3 of them, and they were also involved in actually doing more deeper level community engagement around the park design and elements of the park by going to schools, youth groups, and in the community more broadly. So this is this, as you can see on the right here, is sort of how it looks now. This was like when all the trees are grown and everything like that. It doesn't quite look like that quite now, but this is a picture, a rendering it over here. So I've been engaged in all this work, and so the question is like, well, why wouldn't you continue? Why not continue working at this scale? Because we're trying to community housing, and also New Commons Development, given that the unique niche that they're filling of nonprofit housing developers, there's not a lot of Toronto community housing. It's like one of the probably the best opportunities to work at revitalization and master's planning at that scale in Canada. And but there are a number of areas that I saw that I was seeing was lacking in the planning process, and I really wanted to explore a bit more and find ways of trying to, I guess, solve some of those issues that I saw. So one is that this really stood out to me at the center, and this is sort of where I started too, was the communities. Like, what are the experiences of BIPOCs, of Black, Indigenous, people of color, like racialized individuals and lower income communities? Like, what is their experience of planning, like what is the planning outcome that exists in those communities and what's the impact of it. And I feel that planning wasn't designed for us. You can look at early planning literature that talks about many ways to exclude Black, Indigenous, and racialized populations from in terms of where they could live, where they could rent, services being provided. So it was really clear that planning practice and how we do planning and even the policy that exists really wasn't designed to benefit our communities and to create the best quality of life. And we can see some of the impacts of that in terms of if we look at where we place, there's an idea called environmental racism. So where do we place toxins, waste facilities, pollutants? In Nova Scotia, there's a project that looks at mapping out the placement of these facilities and what communities they're closest to. And overwhelmingly, these are closest to communities that are Black and Indigenous. And this is a pattern that we see not only in Nova Scotia, but in other parts of Canada as well as US. So that's one example that talks about, the planning impacts, that there are policy impacts in terms of like planning and how that impacts the BIPOC communities. Another example is gentrification and revitalization. This is overwhelmingly done in lower income and racialized communities, where it would be those communities where their homes for decades will be demolished. In the Canadian context, we've been generally rebuilding it. That hasn't always been the case. We can cite examples from the US. But what does that mean for the social cohesion, the ways in which people were using this space before, and the ways in which they feel that they belong and are welcomed in the new communities? So that is another example of, is planning actually being designed for us, or are there other outcomes that are being achieved when in the practice of planning that aren't actually centering on the interest and the benefits that can accrue to BIPOC populations? The other thing that I see as a challenge is really around who is planning communities. Generally as a profession, it's very white in the Canadian context, and even in the Toronto context, which is one of the most multicultural cities, we speak of that all the time. But when we look at who's actually planning at the professional level, it generally excludes most folks who are Black, Indigenous, POC, and particularly people who are Black and Indigenous. So what does that mean in terms of what does that mean in terms of engaging with communities? What does that mean in terms of people's ability to bring their lived experience of being part of a particular community, and then being able to bring that knowledge and expertise to the table when thinking about planning communities? There was an article through one of the organizations I'm connected with that we were able to, what we did was we actually went and we talked with students and planners who were racialized, and we asked them about their experiences, and just to understand, like, how has your experience been in the planning profession, or as you tried to transition from school to work, and what do you see some of the barriers? And we entitled it, you can find it online in spacing, we entitled it, "Why is Planning So White?" Because what we found was that there are all these barriers and impediments that make it very difficult for people who are racialized to enter the field, but also to stay, feel supported, actually move up in their careers, and be able to take senior leadership and decision-making roles in the field of planning. And what happens is sometimes people they don't even get hired, so they move into a different field after they come out of school, or if they do get hired, they may often leave. So we're continuing to do that research in a deeper way to look at the experiences of Black individuals in the planning field this summer, and to really understand, like, what is experience, and like what are ways that we can actually find to support and to solve and to support their success in staying in the field of planning. And then if you go over to the third piece here, knowledge, the other gap that is major is that because planning wasn't designed for us, because it generally excludes those of us who are Black, Indigenous, and racialized, the other thing is that what is taught about planning is also excluding those perspectives. So overwhelmingly, planning literature is not reflective of our voices and or our experiences. And so that is only recreating the issue and the problem of not being able to plan for us and not being able to really include us in the profession. And so there are areas there's a lot of areas that have to be worked on there, and that's from how we speak about planning history, who do we study. An example I like to use that we often, one of the key names of planning is the urbanist Jane Jacobs, who's cited often and celebrated for much of the great work that she did. At the same time, there are many people I could identify individuals, W.E.B. Du Bois in the States, and others who have similarly may not have been traditional planners, but they also spoke on these same ideas of community and well-being and design, but we don't cite them in literature in the same way. So there is an unequal attribution and unequal recognition of the voices that have influenced planning. And so one of the things that I'm particularly interested in is understanding a bit more who else has been influenced in the Canadian context, and how do we learn from them, and how do we learn from the experiences of communities so that we can use some of that to both in an educational format, but also in a practice setting as well. So, I mean, I think this kind of sums up, like I see the equity as a gap. We talk about income sometimes, but we almost never talk about race. The community engagement is still lacking. We have very limited in how we speak and how we engage community in these processes. And it typically is we're looking for approvals, not necessarily to authentically understand their concerns and try to respond to them. Collaboration, I see that there are gaps in terms of, as I said, how community practitioners and scholars work together. So we could have a very critical approach from the academia on practice, but then how do we link that to what happens on the ground with practitioners and policies, and therefore the impact in community. And then finally, the pipeline issue. There's a lot of work to be done to engage BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, or racialized individuals in the field of planning. And how do we do that from early in terms of them getting into planning programs and opportunities for jobs to transitioning to more senior roles and leadership positions. So because of those things, one of the reasons for my pivot to doing independent consulting was to free up more time to do more work on several initiatives that I have been working on over the last few years, and to do that more on a more full-time basis rather than working full-time and doing these other initiatives on the side. So the three that I've been engaged in are the Black Planning Project, the Mentoring Initiatives for Indigenous, Black, and Planners of Color, MIPOC, and the Black Planners and Urbanists Association. So the Black Planning Project was the first thing I started with in 2018. And that really just focused on the question of are there other Black planners out there? Who are they? Who are they? And can I get to know them? I want to hear their story. What was their motivation? Because I was really feeling at that point that perhaps I had made the wrong decision and maybe I should leave the field of planning. So I was really thinking of doing that then. And in talking with a few people, I was kind of really encouraged to why don't you just meet others? And why don't you actually start that idea that you've had around talking with Black planners and finding out who they are. So it started as a photo project to really explore and see, who else is out there. And from there, I was able to, as I was talking about it more and more and more, I was able to build a bit more momentum around that idea. And so it's brand new, but and one of the things that enabled me to do was to talk a bit about the project to classes and to students. And in one of those conversations, I had the opportunity to meet some students. It was actually at York University in Toronto in a planning program there. And the question was, they were really interested in learning about, networks for racialized planners and students or practitioners. And I didn't know of any in the Canadian context. And so the suggestion was that, if we're interested, why don't we, that's something that we could explore, and I'd be happy to kind of work with folks. And while there was a network that was looking at city builders called BIPOC City Builders in the city of Toronto, the focus was wider. It wasn't only on planning, and there was a specific interest in trying to create something such as that for planners. So that's how MIPOC emerged, and realized that one of the first things that was critical to success was mentorship. There are a lot of areas of interest, but mentorship was one that we saw was really important. So we thought we'd start with a mentorship program, which after we started MIPOC in 2019, and the beginning of 2019, we began to plan and meet together with students from 3 different universities and 2 others who were interested in kind of returning to planning or exploring planning. And there was a group of 8 of us, and we met for several months before, actually it was almost a year before we launched the first mentorship program. And it actually launched at the beginning of COVID. So last March, we had an online orientation for 16 individuals, so 8 pairs. And then this March, we had a online orientation for 20 pairs, so 40 individuals. They're all BIPOC planners who were students or early in their career. Most of them are students, actually. And then they're matched with other individuals who have a bit more experience in the field, often BIPOC, but also individuals who are not BIPOC and so who are white, who are interested in mentoring and being part of the program. So it's been really exciting to see that program grow and continue to grow. And then finally, the last thing that emerged out of Black Planning Project really was the Black Planners and Urbanists Association. So we had always had a vision with the Black Planning Project to, have some sort of grouping and ways of supporting each other, because as a project emerged, I began to connect people, and we began to meet more regularly. And the impetus of this was really, or I guess why we decided to register last year was really in response to a lot of the Black Lives Matter organizing that had really heightened in response to the murder of George Floyd. So we started this last August. We started to mobilize more in the summertime, and we registered last August, and we've been building it from there, and we're looking forward to launching our membership formally this year. And so that really takes me to the end. I think this is a bit of a journey on different things, so I'm happy to kind of take questions and chat a bit more.
Thank you, Abigail. That was wonderful to hear your path, and very inspiring to see what you're doing to work on the ground, addressing some of these deficits that you're identifying, and I think the connection to communities and empowerment of communities is something that's very meaningful, certainly for me personally, and I think for the students as well. So why don't we open it up to people. I'm going to monitor the chat. Let's see here. And Emily, you've got your hand up and your camera on. Fantastic.
Hi. Thanks, Abigail. That talk was really helpful for a lot of questions. I'm working through my own thesis work. I guess my first question would be thinking about your consultancy work and trying to find your niche within the actual industry is something I've been thinking about a lot. And I'm wondering who your clients are for this work, who hires the services of a planner focused in the area you are, government, cities, private clients. I don't know. That's where, I'm confused in the industry.
Yeah, no, that's a really great question that I don't think I have a full answer to yet. So I can tell you some of it. I've been saying generally that, I left full-time work where I was doing these part-time or because they were really feeling like part-time, like a sort of a job and a half on the initiatives, and to be doing, full-time volunteer almost with part-time work. So the work that I'm really doing is, I continue to do development consulting work. So I'm working with the co-op housing sector on a few sites. And so I'm doing that work as a development consultant. And with the work really around BIPOC initiatives, the way in which I'm engaged there right now as paid work is I am doing something with the University of Toronto. So they are looking at an anti-Black racism and anti-racism audit of the planning program. So it's really kind of going through and understanding with them, with a team of faculty and students, how does a planning program look? What is the curriculum? What are other aspects of the program and the environment and the experience that could be changed to address anti-Black racism? So a university could be a client. I am I have had conversations around like the possibility of clients such as municipalities. So with the Black Planners Association, even though I don't have a client coming out of that, but one of the conversations we've had a few times with planners and managers is really around with how they think about anti-Black racism in the context of planning and planning policy. So that could be another option, because it really would take some work to sit down and to think about the impact of racism and of planning on racism and on shaping our cities. So that could be a potential. I could see municipalities and or governments, but it could also be, I was recently part of a RFP team that was looking at working in a community. So it's an existing community that would involve redevelopment. And one of the areas that they would be interested in is, outside of my experience in affordable housing development, also thinking about, equity and engaging the community and in a responsive fashion. So that is also another way that could be. It could be a housing provider who is trying to do work in a particular community and has an interest in trying to bring a more equitable approach and a more community engaged approach and a reflective approach to how they're working with the community. So those are some options. And a lot of these, as a consultant, you're submitting proposals. And so it's still an option until it actually becomes a reality. But those are some of the ways in which I am kind of engaged in that work potentially.
Cool, thank you. I do have another question, but if someone else wants to go first, I can just mute for a sec. Anyone else? Maybe I'll go ahead.
She's sorry, Emily. Well, either way, yeah. I mean, Titi had her hand up, so maybe why don't we do that, and then you come back. So just hold tight and
Emily could go. It could go ahead.
Okay. All right.
My dog.
Emily, go ahead.
Oh boy.
Okay.
I also saw just a question from Carol that said, "What's your consultancy name?" So right now, with development consulting, I just kind of use my own name. I've done the name, sole proprietorship. You have a GST or a tax HST number. Done that for a while, and so I'm still just working on taking that next step to just register it as a private consultancy. It feels a bit weird to me because I've been doing nonprofit and public work for so long. But so I don't actually have a formal name right now. But with the work that I do with universities and such, that's usually under the Black Planning Project, because that is more like the research base and knowledge generation and looking at engaging communities, which is different than my development consulting work. So I have them under two separate hats. So I think, Emily, you had another question.
Yeah, go ahead, Emily.
Yeah, so this is kind of a complicated one. My thesis work right now is kind of looking at how our current architectural and planning approaches affirm like a lot of narratives of harm, and how by changing the built environment we can kind of restructure them. And I'm specifically looking at sex work and the environments that produce harm around that. So one of the major questions I'm wrestling with is how, as a practitioner, do you work with a community that you don't necessarily identify with? Because it's really amazing to see all the work you're doing to promote BIPOC individuals in the profession, but what do you do, I guess, if you want to serve a community you aren't necessarily a part of and want to be quite sensitive to that?
Yeah, I mean, when I was working in Regent Park, that was a community that I was a part of. I didn't grow up in Toronto. I didn't grow up in social housing, and I didn't grow up in Regent Park specifically. And each community is unique. And for me, one of the ways that I was able to build trust, which was sort of like a big piece of being able to work in Regent Park, was just to, and in any community for that matter, was really to be engaged and to find ways of being involved at different levels. So I spent a lot of time on the ground with different community initiatives. I tried to be involved as much as I could. Even though I was working on the development side, and I didn't always see the value in that, even though now I look back and I see when I was working the development side, a lot of I did work with like youth groups too. There was a community fund that we had to build an infrastructure around, so many meetings around that. when I talked about the Regent Park Athletic Grounds, like that was just intentionally creating very engaged processes to involve people and to have them involved in decision making to some extent. And it wasn't, I'm not going to say that it was like everybody had the opportunity to make all the decisions, because that isn't how it worked. And I think that there were certainly more opportunities, but I think for that level of engagement. But there are approaches that talk about, like, taking an equity lens, and I know and taking more an equity-based lens to looking at design and planning. So that is certainly an approach that can be explored, and it's really trying to focus. And I think practically it's harder, and I think I'm still trying to, particularly because the advantage of working with an organization like such as TCHC is that I became known to the community, and I was working in that community for several years. So you have this opportunity to build trust if you choose to engage in a particular way. But when you're kind of coming in as a consultant, it is a different situation. And I think that we're still, and I say we, like the field, we're still trying to find ways to do that work in a way that would be equitable, that would build trust, and that's actually centering on the experiences of the population. So I don't know, it's not really like a full answer, but I do think that there are some principles when you look at, like, equity-based placemaking that you could perhaps draw on, and in terms of thinking about, how do we center those individuals? What are the real places? Like, how do we establish those principles around, like, what we want to see? And like I say, we collectively, like the community as well. And then also, and how do we get there too? And having all stakeholders engaged in understanding that these are the principles, but these are some practical ways that we hope to get there. So it's a bit of process, but it's also a bit of a commitment to, like, what that outcome looks like as well. So I hope that, and it's a complicated question, so it's not a full answer, but I hope that's helpful.
No, it definitely is. It's always good to have lots of opinions, so thanks so much. I think it was really informative, your talk.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Emily. Chichi has her hand up. Chichi, are you there?
Yeah, hi. Thanks for the presentation, Abigail. I think this feels like it's going to be a lot. But I was recently involved in a community engagement process for the pre-design phase of a new community library and gallery at an office that I just worked at. And so our office's approach to kind of this community engagement, we were supposed to run it, even though a larger office was in charge of the overall project. And so our office kind of is strategized by holding a series of individual virtual engagement sessions. So, like, we would send out these invites, and members of the community, I guess, anyone in the public could come and join those meetings. So we had, like, for example, meetings for seniors. We had a meeting for, like, Indigenous groups, Indigenous, and we had a meeting for Indigenous and Black and minorities. So and then a meeting for, like, LGBT. And so what happened was, I guess, once we get to the meeting for the Black and Indigenous group, and we wanted to get input from the Black community, I, the Black woman in the office, I was, like, the only one in that meeting, even though I'm not part of the community. So it's like, it was kind of unsuccessful in that sense. And I don't know, I feel like, is it weird to kind of single out the groups in that way, where it's like we're having a Black meeting, or like we're having, like, is that odd? And then it's like, how do you approach adjusting this virtual engagement process for different groups? And I guess my question is, like, what is your experience with community engagement and even digital community, this virtual community engagement process? And do you think that, like, how would it be best to kind of reach out to that group, right? Is this, like, something where you're like, oh, we're having a community engagement session, and you send out flyers or something, like, to schools? Like, how best do you really, if you want to really get input from such a small segment of the population, like the Black community was in the city that we were working in, like, how would you reach them?
Yeah. I mean, I think with to the first part of the question around engaging individuals, like do you segment and kind of compartmentalize the groups? I mean, I really think it depends on the topic. And if there is if there are existing tensions and things like that, that's sometimes a really valuable way to ensure that different voices are heard and they feel that they can voice their concerns, and particularly if they may not be comfortable doing that in a more public environment. So I think that can be beneficial. I would say that probably it's really trying to kind of connect with who's on the ground in those communities, and it's never really a perfect thing, but sometimes there are organizations that you can at least tap into who are really connected to particular communities, and so therefore those organizations can be a way to then have to broaden that engagement and through their constituents and the people who participate in their programs or services or whatever it is. Those individuals can actually connect with them and share the opportunity for engagement. I think that's one, and there is sometimes the community leader or individuals who are known too. So I think it's a mix between tapping into those local groups and also tapping into organizations as well. And in terms of the how or the best way to engage, what does that process look like? I haven't, unfortunately, given the pandemic and the stage of my projects, I actually haven't. And when you work in the development side, unless you're going through a specific approval, you're not really in the community engagement phase. And so the projects I was working on, we were either past the approval stages because it was a retrofit. The approval was very different. It was really engaging with the stakeholders such as the municipality, the board of the organization, and the staff of the organization. And so I haven't actually done a lot of the engagement digitally with different communities yet, over the last year, just based on the communities have not really been the on the ground communities in the same way, geographic or ethnic in that way, unless they were kind of predetermined groups. So I that's something I'm still actually exploring, and you probably, because you've done that already, you probably have more advice to offer me.
Yeah.
But I certainly do think that designing with the community is one of the things. So even in our conversations with municipalities, it's really trying to understand who are you connected to right now? And if you're not, then your first step is trying to figure out who do you know who is a black or BIPOC group in your municipality, and how do you begin to understand who they are, and also to allow them to understand your process, because the planning process, the approvals process is not something that's easily understood and easily accessible. So there's an educational element so people know how they can be involved. And if they feel that that's not enough, then they can kind of shift and they can say, well, no, this is how we think would be important. So I see it as being kind of collaborative. I know in the city in Halifax Regional Municipality, there's a project I know there that is a Black-led project. And yeah, there's been quite a bit of concern around the digital engagement and just the access to the community. And so what I've seen is that the organization that's actually putting forward the development application has done a lot of their own work to reach out really, really, really broadly to different constituents in the community and different organizations to say, we're putting this forward, we'd like your support. If you have any questions, contact us. So they've actually opened up the space for a lot more engagement outside of the formal process of 2 or 3 mandatory community consultation or public meetings that the municipality might hold to. And they've actually pushed in some regards for earlier consultations specifically with the Black community or the Indigenous community in order to hear their concerns around a particular development site before they broaden it to the more general public. So they're building that into their process too. So I hope that's helpful. But it is a challenge right now.
Yeah, no, this has definitely been interesting. I think stuff like, MyPOC is, and even your consultancy seems like a great way to get involved in community, or to even kind of specialize. Like if I ever wanted to do that, it'd be interesting to join a group like that and kind of approach architecture through that side of things, being involved in the community engagement processes as a Black designer. So
No, thank you for your question.
No problem. Thanks for the answer.
Thanks, Titi. Great questions. I hope we can have more coming too. And let's see here. I think so far. I mean, I'm interested, Abigail, to hear. I mean, I think so just a bit of background context. So in this course, I generally invite a developer of some kind. And when I learned about you and your work with New Commons particularly, first of all through New Commons, but I think obviously more broadly, I thought this would be really great to invite you to come and speak. And so I'm just, in terms of could you talk a little bit about New Commons? And I mean, you were drawn to work there, obviously. You're very motivated towards community engagement and towards community enhancement and enrichment and capacity building and all that sort of thing. So from that perspective, I mean, there's so many things I'd love to hear you talk about, but I think in terms of just thinking about the course and the question of planning and communities, is there anything more that you might be able to tell us about in terms of some of those initiatives and how they're working, and how you engaged with those while you were there?
Yeah, I think so. It's interesting because I think that the one difference I noticed going from TCHC, Toronto Community Housing, to New Commons Development was that because Toronto Community Housing generally had existing communities that were doing work within, that was sort of like, the constituent to some extent. Like those were the individuals that I would be kind of trying to work with. Whereas New Commons, it was, you realize the disconnect sometimes between the developer role, even as a nonprofit developer role, and the community in terms of the level of engagement I may have when I'm in that development role. So certainly, as I said, the projects that I was working on during my time there, they were early feasibility, and one of my colleagues was working on a project that actually just was finished construction, they moved in, and so the client was typically a nonprofit organization. So in terms of engaging the community, we would most closely work with that organization who was owning the land and whomever else they would involve more broadly. So that would be, so if they had members or they had participants in programs that they wanted to engage, then that's how we might engage them. But the broader sort of community engagement that I was really used to at TCHC didn't happen in the same way at New Commons. However, one of the projects I had in Halifax, we were trying to move and trying to solve that, because one of the issues was that in North End Halifax had seen a lot of gentrification, and the local community that had been there long term, that was had a high percentage of Black individuals, was seeing that a lot of the condominiums and new developments weren't actually available for them. They weren't accessible, they weren't affordable. And so they were really, really concerned with any new development. We're very, very vocal. And so one of the early conversations we had was, how do we, as we develop this new cooperative, think about and design it, how do we think about engaging that community from early on? So one of the ways in which we did that was to first engage United Way, that had a fairly good community engagement program. But even within the first or second conversation, they were like, we're actually not the ones to be mostly engaged in the community. There's this organization that grew up out of the community that you should work with and that we can engage, and that organization can facilitate the broader community engagement. So when I left in January, we were just moving into the process of, like, we'd finished our first phase of design, got into the feasibility, we're submitting our first application, getting ready to submit the first application to the Halifax Regional Municipality. And we were then, we had conversations already with that community group so that they were aware of the different steps. And we were building an engagement process with them to talk with the community to get their input into the design. So I was really, it was kind of sad to leave at that point, because it was probably the most community engaged project I had been involved in my 3 years at New Commons. But I was hopeful because there was a commitment from both the cooperative that was actually, who owned the land, as well as a commitment from the United Way, who was working with them, to say that we need to work very locally. We recognize there are concerns, and we need to be able to be responsive to them and create a process with the community, with this lead organization, that would then be sure to engage folks respectfully and hear their concerns and figure out ways that we could actually design. So I hope that helps, but those were some ways. But I think for me, I really was kind of pushing. I was like, I know, I'm aware of the environment, so we have an opportunity to do something differently. So let's really think about how we do it differently so that we don't end up like building something and it's not going to look good as a nonprofit developer to, build something and then we have a community that's adjacent to us that isn't happy with what was constructed in the end. So yeah. I think you're muted.
I forget. Part of the reason I'm very interested in that is that I think that the distinction between community or municipal initiatives and community groups, and then the whole question of equity, equity on the one hand, and then capital on the other hand, and how to it's not part of the development process in private development, generally speaking, to engage with communities and to it's they're kind of at odds with one another. So that's one of the things that I think is so interesting to hear about is how even private capital can be leveraged to work appropriately with communities and to build for those communities as opposed to exclude those communities. And so that seems like there's a big piece there. And the private sector, if there can be models for the private sector to engage in different ways than is the norm, perhaps there's good potentials there. And so that's part of what I'm interested in is civic-owned entities on the one hand versus private entities, and how there can be a synergy that brings the kind of goals of community advancement together, and addressing those, ultimately those systemic questions of asset and lack of assets in certain communities through essentially a racist society that we live in. Those kinds of things, somehow globally we have to figure out how to address these issues and to redress those imbalances and so on. And so those are huge questions, of course, but I'm fascinated to and hopeful that there can be models that are out there that we can, that as a larger collective we can follow and start to think, could we redress some of these imbalances that exist through historical inequities in ownership and assets that parts of communities have. Yeah, so that's a complicated thing.
No. I mean, and I would just add that, I think there's a unique opportunity. And because being a nonprofit real estate developer, you have a different profit motive. That line is cut out of your performance. So you're not thinking about what profit can I make? You need it to balance. You need to work and be sustainable. But that's one thing. And I think the other thing is that there's generally and ideally a set of principles that we're working towards that that are maybe more aligned with community goals, and particularly if you're talking about a cooperative. Or if you're talking about a social service agency or a faith institution that has been using its space in a particular way to engage the community and serve the community more broadly, it's easier to get to those conversations and to create that space. But there needs to be intentionality around creating the space, but there also needs to be, a commitment, which is what I was, I think, to the first question that I received, a commitment to actually those outcomes as well. So we can build an equitable approach and process, but we also need to ensure that the outcomes are equitable, which I think sometimes we have this great process, but then the outcomes don't necessarily change. And there's an opportunity for the outcomes to look different if you have a different understanding and a different set of principles that you're bringing to land ownership, land use.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. Well, that's very inspiring. Let's see if there are any other. Do we have any? Oh, okay. So Emily's got another one. What is the role of architects in the community engagement planning process? What kinds of architects stroke firms would work with consultancy planners, such as Abigail? Not sure if she has access to this chat. Yeah, she does, I think, Emily. I missed a bit of the beginning of the talk, so if it was covered, ignore and I'll find out. No, I don't think that was covered. I think it's a great question, actually, because what we're seeing, and part of the reason I wanted to invite Abigail was that she's not an architect; she's a planner, and she's working in not-for-profit development with communities, and therefore playing a different role. And we've talked through the course about this, that planners and developers have the capacity to work alongside architects, hopefully with common goals, and so I think that's exactly what you're talking about in your question, Emily. So.
Okay. Yeah. I think that the example that I gave, so one for the community facility, which is a park, so it's a bit of a different design, but I'll talk really briefly after about a building. But like throughout, I mean, the first consultant that we're hiring is an architect, generally speaking, outside of any due diligence consultants. And if I think about the experience in the co-op, I'll start with the co-op actually, was that we really were, we're thinking, like, they're bringing their expertise around, you know, trying to get us as building with maybe a certain number of units and all those other things, but we're, the community engagement side is that their ability to work with us, to kind of go out there and have that conversation with the community, to present the designs, to hear the community's feedback, and then to be able to also make any adjustments and integrate comments and things like that in the design, and be able to bring that information back and help us to solve issues around like what that design might look like. So, for example, if I think about the cooperative, in a few projects, sometimes it's been maybe if we're as specific as a unit design, sometimes it could be the kitchen layout. And so, like, how do you help us solve that? Or if we're thinking about accessibility, perhaps it's as simple as this doesn't actually function well. We had a group at Toronto Community Housing that was really focused on accessibility. And so what that meant was like multiple iterations of the design and sitting down with the architect to review and to think about the unit design and how it could better respond to accessibility needs. And so there's lots and there's ample opportunity if the developer creates that room, if the client is interested in creating that room, to have that dialogue between the community and the architect in order to influence the design process. And if I look at the example of Regent Park Athletic Grounds, we essentially knew we had a piece of land, we had a sense of, from the funders, what the key elements of the facility might be. And then we said to the architect, when we even hired them, we were like, this is going to be a very community engaged process. We'll have an advisory or community engagement committee, something like that, and you'll be working with them alongside this process. And so their role was really to work with some youth who were in high school and junior high to explain the design process, to explain their designs, so that when we were going into the community and the architect wasn't there, we had enough knowledge, and the youth had enough knowledge to actually talk about the goals, what the drawings meant, and then to get impact and to take that feedback from the community and bring it back to the architect. So that was, so there can be, there's a concept called, I'm sure you're aware of it, like community design or social design, but just that whole idea of like the ways in which as design professionals you can work with community in a very community engaged way. So there are certainly, I've seen that, I think that's the most important thing, to have an architect in selecting them, that they understand, they have that flexibility, they have that willingness to build in the experience both of the developer, but also the opportunities for comments from community to create a responsive design. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, that's an awesome answer. It's really exciting. So thanks again. I have so many questions.
Yeah, but it's a lot of pushing sometimes too. Like, and I think the selection of the architect is really, really important for me. Like, I remember one process we went through, and just from talking with the architect and responding to some questions in their RFP, I was like, no, if this is your response to our RFP questions, then this is telling me that this is not going to be a process that you're going to probably be really responsive and open to comments from a broader constituent in your design. So it is challenging, because sometimes that, you know, the ultimate building, you often have conversations with architects. It's like, this is beautiful, but we can't afford this, or it's not functional in this way, or it's not achieving this goal. And so how can you work with us to still create something that is, you know, beautiful and that's appealing and that aesthetically pleasing, at the same time that it's functional and it's affordable. So it's particularly with nonprofit housing, there's always that negotiation.
That's an awesome practical answer, so thanks a lot.
Maybe there's one thing I just was going to add here, and not trying to take anything away from what Abigail has to say here, but you mentioned ERA and working with them, and to Emily's question about who are the architects or how does this work, I know that ERA has done a variety of community engagement projects. They did a variety of little design build projects in Nova Scotia or Newfoundland and in other places in the north and so on, which are really about kind of building small community assets with students, architecture students. They did some work with students from McGill, and I think maybe from Halifax as well, from Dalhousie. And so and I know some of the principals there, and they do have. They're a functioning architectural business, of course, and they do regular projects. But I think that they are an example, and I'm sure there are others too, but of architects who do engage in. Maybe perhaps just call it a different kind of process, and perhaps one that's more community engaged in some of their projects. And I'm curious, Abigail, when you were working with them, was there kind of buy-in, engagement and buy-in from them in terms of process for community engagement?
Yeah, certainly. I think that the experience I had working with them, so I know the work that they've done at TCHC, where I wasn't directly involved in those projects, but majority of if they're retrofits or if they're infill pieces of work that are happening at TCHC, a lot of them are community engaged. So, and ERA has been part of a lot of those. So certainly from that, just from knowledge of how we have done things at TCHC and how things were done at TCHC while I was there, and moving on to, certainly. And I think in the specific experience I had with them on the seniors building, I mean, it was seniors buildings, because it was a set of 3 buildings. 2 of them were 300 units, and there was a lot of work, a lot of conversation with the board of directors and with staff in terms of trying to come to the appropriate level of retrofits for those units and redesigning of particular elements. And so certainly there was a lot of engagement. We weren't engaging the broader senior population in the same way, in part because as we're getting to some of those decisions, COVID had already started, but also because some of the major decisions were really much more technical in terms of building systems, but there was always lots of conversation and a lot of integration with the building staff and the board of directors too. So certainly, yes, that's been something it's great to have an architect that has that commitment and that experience and processes and experience of doing that. Even though it's still good to have an architect who's open and who's willing to kind of learn from planner and developer and others to kind of work in that collaborative way.
It's also interesting to note, I mean, you were talking about the Tower Renewal Project, and as I'm sure you know, Graham Stewart, who is one of the partners, he did the Tower Renewal Initiative as his master's thesis at UMT architecture, and then really leveraged that into big movement. I mean, it's a huge enterprise, and he's not the only one, but I mean, he kind of, as his master's architecture thesis. So I think for the students to know that, you know, there's things that you're doing now as your master's that could, if the circumstances are right, let's call it that, that could become something really big. And Graham Stewart's an amazing guy, and at some point I'd like to have him come back and talk. We've had him a couple of times at the school, but it is really quite an inspirational thing. And I think along the lines of what you're saying, Abigail, about your process in terms of growing up in Halifax and knowing the community that you're with, and then that you had connection to, and then coming back and kind of doing work there. Those kinds of things are, our connections, our personal kind of passions and opportunities that we make are definitely connected, and that's one of the things I'm hoping that will come out of this series of talks, is that people kind of sort of see pathways for themselves in terms of opportunities and things that they really care about, and how they can leverage those into an aspect, at least, of their professional life as an architect, as a planner, as a whatever the field one is in. That's my hope, that this helps facilitate people knowing that those are possibilities that are out there for them. I'm only saying lots of questions. So I guess we're an hour and a quarter in, and probably, I know Abigail's got a busy schedule always, and so I should probably, unless there are other questions, should probably wrap up. Anything else anybody wants to bring up, or questions for Abigail? So I guess I'll just leave it at that. And thanks again, Abigail, for your contribution here. It's really, really inspiring and really wonderful to have you come and join us, and we really appreciate that very much. So thank you.
Okay, thank you for having me, and thank you for the questions that got me thinking. So hopefully the answers were adequate, and it's like, I'll say it's a learning process, and you kind of participate in some things, and then you hope to have big visions around how things may happen, and and try to find ways of collaborating, bringing people in, learning new processes, tools to actually get there. So for me, it was really going back a lot to the vision. And I still try to do that. Like, what was it why did I come into planning in the first place? And am I even getting there? And that has helped me to kind of inform my different moves, my different pivots. So thanks, and all the best to you all as you kind of move forward.
Yeah, thanks. 1 second here. Actually, I just wanted to mention Carol Boucher had a comment saying UW could likely use your service to audit their planning department too. So maybe I have some colleagues in planning, and maybe I'll talk to them and see whether we can get you a gig at UW to kind of audit their planning, if you're interested.
Sounds good.
Great. All right.
Good. All right.
Thanks very much. And so class, we'll be meeting back at 1:30.